Hello, everyone. D. Alfred Ostrowski here, and in this recording, I'm going to be going through the basic mechanics of building and deploying a Dockerized React web application to AWS Fargate. I'm starting with an EC2 C5 large instance with Ubuntu. And I already have the associated libraries already installed on that instance. And I'm going to start from the point of the Create React app. And I'm going to have all the steps that got me to this point well documented with the associated GitHub that should be below this recording. This is an overview of the steps that I'm going to go through. I'm going to work through the Create React app. The first step, I've already installed React, Node, and some of the other associated libraries that I use with React. I'm going to be adding 2 configuration files to do that Docker build. Then I'm going to build and test my Hello World React application as a Docker image. I'm going to establish a registry with the Elastic Container Registry on AWS and obtain the appropriate IAM credentials to do command line pushes to push my Dockerized image to the registry. From there, I'm going to create a target group and associated load balancer. This is going to give me access to the actual deployed application. And I'm going to define a task definition and start. A Fargate cluster gives me a serverless implementation and voids the details of cluster configuration. I'm going to initiate a service inside of the Fargate cluster and test appropriately. So let's get started. I have a PuTTY instance to the EC2 instance that I have already started. Let me just step through that. Again, I have a C5 large instance. And hopefully you have some familiarity with AWS already. I use the Ubuntu and the default Ubuntu 2204. And I picked C5 as my instance type, and I generated the associated key pair. So I'm ready to go. I'm going to run the Create React and create my application I'm going to be using here. So I'm going to be dragging a lot of the commands, but I'm going to make these all available on the associated GitHub for you. So you can duplicate exactly what I'm working through. Now I'm in the base home Ubuntu directory. If I do the pwd, so I'm going to create a React project called React Docker AWS. Now while I'm doing that, I'm going to go to my EC2 instance and make sure that it is set up appropriately. So when I build the Docker image, that I can run it inline and test it as such. So I'm going to avoid doing that NPS test just for brevity here. So I have my EC2 instance, and again, that is running in the background. Go to my instance types, and I'm going to bring up my associated instance and look at the security group. Now I need to set up a security group so I can access it and test my Docker file appropriately before I proceed. So I'm going to go into security and check my security groups. Whoops, lost my screen there for a second. I'm going to set up 3 inbound rules. Maybe a little bit overkill, but this is going to get me through the entire deployment process. So I'm in inbound rules. Click on my security group. Now I can edit my inbound rules. I'm going to create 3 inbound rules that do all traffic. And I'm going to IP4 for the first and IP 6 on the second. Then I'm going to set up a third rule. And this is also going to be all traffic. In this case, I'm going to do a custom, and I'm going to loop back to my security group. This is going to get me through the Fargate cluster. 0049. Let me scroll down to find that. I have a ton of security rules here. A lot of different instances. You may not have as much, so it's not going to be as hard to find. See if I can find that here. There it is. Okay, so I search on that, 498, 479. So this is a loop back to the same security rules. I'm going to save those rules. And once I do the Docker build and the image is set up, then I can loop back to that and shouldn't have any problems at all. And I can go back to my instance and get the DNS, clicking under details, and I can put that in my buffer. So I've created my React file, and I'm going to create 2 additional files. This is to be located on the GitHub. And first, I'm going to create some extra directories to put that in. I'm going to create a conf directory, cd to the conf, and then I'm going to create another directory called conf.d and cd to that. And I'm going to create, using the VI editor, a default conf as such, and load in the associated configuration file. It's going to allow the server to point to that containerized file, port 80, and set up the appropriate directory locations for the use of the Nginx engine. You drill back down to the main directory. I'm going to create a Docker file and set up similar configurations to support that Docker build. Again, all these files can be located on the GitHub, and you won't have to pour over the video here. I'm going to step through these very briefly. If you want more detail, there's a lot of more detailed information how Docker works. Here, just want to get you up and running with the basic mechanics. Here I'm going to be using the 16.5.0 Alpine library. I'm set up the appropriate working directory and the associated environments and address the node modules that were associated with my React build. Do an npm build, reference the Nginx engine with Alpine, and support the update of the configuration files, bring in static files, set up a port at 80, and run the Nginx engine. So now at this point, I am ready to do a Docker build, and then we can test that. I'm going to put sudo in front of the Docker command. So I'm going to do a sudo docker build -t React Docker AWS and associated tag latest, and the dot is going to address this to be done in the current directory, which I'm in the current project directory. So this may complain a little bit, and give me some warning files. And once it completes, then I'm going to test this directly in the directory in which it has been built and verify that I have a working Docker image file to be deployed to the Fargate cluster. Now, the Fargate cluster, again, is going to give me quick means of employing a serverless implementation that I don't have to worry about a lot of the configuration activities that would be associated with a regular cluster deployment. So this is almost done. I go on a hold, but it should be complete in just a few seconds. Following this, I'm going to do a Docker run. And that'll allow me to run the image inline directly from this directory. And then I can grab that DNS from my cluster and touch the React web application from the browser. And this is almost done. Looks like it's running appropriately. Take a few more seconds here. And I look like I have a successful build, and now I can run that. I'm going to do a sudo docker run -p 3080 with the project name and latest tag. So it looks like it's up and running. I can bring in a browser and perform a test. I grab the public IP address, and I can pull in a new tab. And I want to touch this from port 3000. So now I have a successful Docker build, and I'm able to access it from my EC2 cluster. Again, the advantage here is that I'm doing this all within the AWS instances. So I have a higher level of compatibility in my Docker file with the Fargate cluster implementation. So I'm going to shut down this client and stop running my Docker file, and now I can start to get ready for the deployment to a Fargate cluster. So to do that, I'm going to need to establish an ECR, Elastic Container Registry. I'll search on ECR to get to that. So you see I already have a few repositories. I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to name it as a private repository. I'm going to call this React Docker AWS. Let me call this Fargate. Don't think I have a name conflict. And create that repository. Now when I highlight this, I can click in. I don't have any images. So that's my next step, is to generate that images, and I have associated commands that allow me to accomplish that. Before I do that, I need to establish credentials to be able to empower the command line to perform these push commands that AWS is providing for me. So I'm going to leave this here and just start a new tab and go to the directly to IAM in my console. And I can search on IAM. It's going to take me there. Of course, I had it in my recently accessed. You may not have it there. So I'm going to the Identity Access Management console. I'm going to click on users. I'm going to create a new user. Have any here, so I'm going to start from scratch. I'm going to call this React AWS. And I'm going to choose provide user access to AWS Management Console. And I want to create an IAM user. I'm going to omit the Identity Center. And I'm going to create an auto-generated password. And I'm going to next through that. I'm going to add this user to a group. And in this case, I don't have any groups, so I'm going to create one. So I'm going to call it React Docker group. And I only need one policy, and that is administrator access. and I'll click user group. From that, I can now select the group that I want to add the user to and move forward with that. Now it's going to give me everything for review. And I'm going to create my user. It's going to give me a username password for the console. I can download that. I'm not going to be using that. What I am going to be using is the specific password for the command line access. So now I can access my username. I'm going to go to security credential. I'll try to screenshot all these so you'll have a hard copy means of access. So I have access keys. I'm going to create an access key. And let me click into that. And I'm going to choose command line interface CLI. And I'm going to understand the recommendations. It's asked for a tag. I don't need one. I'm going to create the access key. So it gives me an access key and a secret access key. I'm going to go off screen and I'm going to save that information now. So when I do a configure, then I can reference that key. That'll give me the logon capability. So I have to be extremely careful with that. And by no means do you want to show this to anyone or put it anywhere near a GitHub page. That's definitely something that you add to a Git ignore or omit completely. So the next step before I do those push commands, I'm going to do an AWS configure. And it is going to prompt me for the access key. For that, I am going to go off screen to be able to accomplish that. And I'll pause for a second. I'll put the information in, and then we will proceed. Okay, I did the AWS configure. It asked me for the user credential and the secret password key. I've entered that in also with the region, and I defaulted the last prompt. Now I'm ready to proceed with the configuration commands. So the first command that is presented here, let me get back to that in the registry, doesn't work appropriately. So I have a slight reformulation of that, and I'm going to pull that in right here. And I'm going to make this available so you can run this appropriately. So here I'm going to, instead of that login command provided, I have a slight variation of that sudo docker login -u AWS -p with the login information and the associated mnemonic. So you're going to need that. And since I gave it the appropriate IAM credential, that login proceeded, and I can move forward with the remaining commands. And these work verbatim here. I'm going to just do a Docker build again as proceeded. But I need to use the sudo as before. The next command is going to perform the tag. And now I can do the push. It looked like work appropriately. Let's go to the registry and make sure that it's there. So let me refresh the registry. It should be showing up right at this point. So now we have the registry set up, and I have an associated URI with that. I'm going to be referencing that as I move forward. So I built the image, I established the ECR, the IAM credentials, I pushed it. So I'm at the step 11. Now I'm going to move forward and set up the target group and associated load balancer. This is going to allow for the web-based access to the cluster once I have set that up appropriately. So I broke down these steps. In the context of building a load balancer, I can create a target group. I separated the two, and then you can populate that target group as I build the load balancer. That way it's somewhat self-verifying. So let me go to EC2, and we can accomplish that. So go back to EC2. And I'm going to scroll down here, and it has target groups. I'm going to first create a target group. I don't have any established at this point. I'm going to set it up as IP addresses. Everything else I'm going to default is going to be HTTP port 80, IPv4, HPD1, and it's going to, whoops, I have to give it a name. So let me call it React AWS group. And create my target group. Very good. Now I can create my load balancer. And I'm going to create it as an application load balancer. Go there. And I'm going to call it, give it a name, React AWS. Let's call it React AWS load balancer. Leave it as internet facing. IPv4. I'm going to default the security group. And it has 4 mappings. I'm in the West 2A. So I'm going to choose all 4 subnets that are provided here. Default my security group. It has listeners and routing, and here it's prompting me for a target group. I'm going to select that target group that I just created. Now I could actually create the target group here. Again, I prefer to break it down a little bit and do it beforehand. That way I know in most cases that that if I have created it correctly, I can select it from the drop-down and somewhat, as I mentioned, self-verifying there. Everything else is appropriate. I can look at the summary. It looks appropriately. So I'm going to create my load balancer. This will have its own DNS associated with, and that's how I'm going to access the final deployed application. Now I'm going to create a task definition. I'm going to do this under the ECS, or Elastic Container Service. Task definitions. I'm going to create a new task definition, just default, and I'm going to call it React AWS task definition. Here it's going to prompt me for the URI that I used with my container registry. So let me go back to that. I can bring in a new tab, and I can switch through and pull up that URI. So here is my registry, and I'm going to copy that URI to pull that in to my task definition. Call this React AWS container. I can move forward with that. For my app environment, I'm going to choose AWS's Fargate is a default. I can go between EC2 or Fargate. Fargate's default. If it's not, you want to go back and choose Fargate. Linux, and I leave everything else as a default. Storage I leave as a default. Monitoring and tagging I leave as a default. And I should be good to create my load balancer. Prompts me to review it, and it should be appropriate, and I'm going to do the creation. Now I can start my cluster. Let me go into cluster. I'm going to choose create cluster. Let's call it React AWS cluster. Default to networking. Subnets are populated. Infrastructure is default to AWS Fargate. And I should be good to go. This will take a few minutes to initiate. And then the final step here is to initiate a service within the Fargate cluster. And then I can test it by grabbing the DNS from my load balancer and open up yet another tab in the same fashion that I tested my standalone image file. Let's give this a few seconds. Now, if this takes 20 minutes or something, an inordinate amount of time, then something wasn't configured appropriately. In some cases, it may not give you an error. So when they say a few minutes, they mean it should only take a few minutes. I'll go off a hold if this takes a little bit longer than usual, but in some cases, again, you may not get an appropriate error message. It looked like it started appropriately, so I can click into my existing cluster. And now I can create a service. So I go to services and I do create. Existing cluster is set up here. And I'm going to specify that task definition. Family, and I'm going to associate a service name, React, let's call it React AWS service. Everything else I default except for the load balancer. I want to pull in that load balancer and make the association here. And I want to use my I could create a new one, but again, I choose to make sure that I'm pulling in my existing load balancer, listener, and associated target group. I can click down here, click down and use the React AWS group. And now I should be good to create it. Scroll back up, and this will take, again, an additional few minutes. Takes an inordinate amount of time. You may have an error, and it may not give you appropriate diagnostics for it. While that's running, I can start an EC2 reference and grab my DNS in anticipation of this running appropriately, and I can grab the DNS for my load balancer so I can test that as soon as it is up and running. So let's click into the load balancer. I don't even have to click in. I can just grab that DNS copy name, and let's see. Well, the service looks like it's deployed appropriately, and you can get additional information on it. However, I have a status as active. Everything's green. QMF is completed. So let's test the deployed AWS Fargate cluster. Pull in a different screen, and I don't believe I need the extra port here. And there you have it. So successful completion. So what do we accomplish here? We created a create React, the default React application. We Dockerized it, put it in a Docker file, built that image and tested it as such from an EC2 C5 Ubuntu cluster. Then I established a container registry. We obtained the appropriate IAM credentials to send it to the host and establish it in the registry. Then I set up a target group, configured it as an IP and the associated load balancer. From there, we created a task definition, started the Fargate cluster and the associated service. And from there, we have tested it successfully as an AWS Fargate cluster. Thanks for listening. I hope this helps. All the associated information be in the associated GitHub with this recording. Good luck with it. Take care. Thank you.